The Kingdom of Bahrain, named for the two seas surrounding the archipelago, hosts the Naval Support Activity Bahrain, a US naval base. Bahrain itself is a fascinating mix of Bahraini nationals, American and British military, and immigrants. Immigrants make up approximately 45% of the population. Some came to Bahrain to work in the oil and gas industry, and some came to support a burgeoning and more illicit trade. It's an unfortunate but seemingly universal truth that where there are oil fields and military bases, the sex trade usually follows. For Calvin Halfacre, with the might of the American dollar behind him, the allure of commercial sex was too much to resist. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. Logistics Specialist Chief Calvin Halfacre worked his way up to E7 throughout his career in the Navy. He'd served in a few different roles, and at one of his commands he even worked with survivors of sexual assault, helping them access supportive services and ensuring their safety concerns were being met and being taken seriously. Halfacre and his family were stationed in Jacksonville, Florida, leading up to 2016. Then, Halfacre followed the call of duty on an unaccompanied tour in Bahrain. An unaccompanied tour is one where the service member's dependents remain behind. In mid-March 2016, Halfacre executed a limited durable power of attorney from Bahrain. The power of attorney granted his wife the ability to purchase their family home on Baxter Creek Drive on his behalf. The 4-bedroom, 4-bath home was the perfect home base for their family while Calvin served overseas. People living at a different duty station than their family are called geo-bachelors. The new duty station is geographically undesirable for some reason, so the family opts to live separately. I've heard many great reasons to do this: access to healthcare, education, proximity to family, unique resources to meet a family need. In fact, my parents very generously lived separately from us while I was in high school because they prioritized stability in our education. The United States has maintained a naval presence in the Kingdom of Bahrain for the last 70 years. It has grown from a handful of buildings to a comprehensive support system for sailors and their families. In Bahrain, there is not a significant amount of on-base housing, so families and those over E5 live off-base. Calvin Halfacre, an E7, arrived to the island and found an apartment that suited his needs. But, in this apartment, Halfacre really put the bachelor into geo-bacheloring. He frequented local bars and chatted up women. Halfacre was 7,400 miles from home and burdened by a 7-hour time difference. As his children returned from school on a Friday afternoon, it was already date night in Bahrain. But Halfacre wasn't frequenting just any bar. He was going to bars known to traffic in prostitution. His chats with women weren't exercises in flirtation. They were negotiations. Halfacre met the women, hired them, paid them, and then took them home to his off-base apartment. When Halfacre decided he wanted more than what they negotiated, he took it by force. On September 12, 2017, an 18-year-old Thai sex worker referred to by the pseudonym Mary met Halfacre at Wrangler, an off-base bar. Mary and Halfacre negotiated a price of about $145 American and set off. Halfacre drove Mary back to his apartment, and led her inside. They made small talk before engaging in consensual vaginal intercourse. Then, Halfacre sodomized Mary without her consent. She gave a verbal no and moved to get away from Halfacre. He grabbed her hair to restrain her and pressed her face into a pillow to muffle her screams. When Halfacre finished brutalizing Mary, she escaped to the bathroom and dressed. They walked from the apartment together. Halfacre had promised to drive Mary back to Wrangler. Instead, he made an excuse at the elevator and said he needed to grab something from inside his apartment. He said he'd be right back. But when he returned to his apartment, he locked the door behind him. Mary rang the doorbell, but Halfacre didn't respond. Out of options, Mary sent a location pin to her mama-san, to a woman who essentially acted as her manager. Mary's mama-san arrived in a taxi to retrieve her and discovered Mary crying and in pain. The taxi driver told Mary and the mama-san that this was not unusual, that he'd picked up other women who reported being attacked by Halfacre. Mary's mama-san brought her to Naval Criminal Investigative Services, NCIS, to report the attack. NCIS agents requested a safe kit, a sexual assault forensic examination. But Naval Branch Health Clinic Bahrain declined to conduct one because Mary, a Thai national, was a third country national, neither an American nor a Bahraini. 2 other women came forward that fall in 2017 and made similar allegations against Halfacre, that they consented to vaginal sex, but that Halfacre anally raped them. One of these victims noticed when she began to arrange her own travel home, Halfacre stole the money he'd paid her at the bar. NCIS agents brought Halfacre in for questioning on October 6, 2017. He invoked his right to remain silent and asked for an attorney. Later, Halfacre asked a big favor of another sailor. He asked his friend to reach out to the women at the heart of the investigation and tell them that Halfacre was willing to pay money for them to drop the allegations against him. While stationed in Bahrain, Halfacre hired sex workers at least 3 times. I say at least because there are only 3 women who came forward. It would seem possible that there are additional women out there that Halfacre hired but did not assault, or those that he assaulted who did not come forward. All 3 women that came forward were originally from Thailand, drawn or brought to Bahrain to engage in commercial sex. Bahraini laws strictly prohibit prostitution. However, Bahrain has a bit of a reputation globally. This nation, known for social conservatism and religiously motivated public restrictions, is also known for being a sex tourism destination. The Bahrain Youth Society for Human Rights estimates that there were more than 13,500 sex workers in the country as of 2007. The kingdom faces a growing sex trafficking problem. And police in Bahrain ostensibly investigate every prostitution case as a potential sex trafficking case. But published investigation outcomes suggest that the police have a challenging time screening for victimization. NCIS agents began to dig into Halfacre's time in Bahrain and worked up the case against him. Eventually, prosecutors charged Halfacre with 3 specifications of patronizing a prostitute and 3 specifications of sexual assault. But they ran into a predictable problem. Halfacre's victims, women entrenched in the commercial sex trade, became increasingly difficult to get in touch with. Without their participation, proving sexual assault would be nearly impossible. Naval prosecutors moved to admit evidence of the sexual assault allegations, including 2 video-recorded interviews of the victims. During these interviews, the women spoke Thai, and Mary's mama-san translated. Mary's mama-san, it turned out, was also an informant with NCIS. Halfacre's victims didn't speak fluent English or Arabic, which I point out because Halfacre's attorneys later alleged that their translator had motive to fabricate, as she was an informant for NCIS on a human trafficking case. I find defense counsel's argument around a biased translator so striking because Halfacre had no issue with the fact that the women didn't speak fluent English while he negotiated sex acts with them. Their fluency only mattered when it was convenient for him, when he could argue that it might make him somehow less culpable. Further, I didn't find anything that suggested the informant was mistranslating what the women said. The defense team further argued that the victims were not victims at all, that they were essentially co-conspirators in the, quote, victimless crime of prostitution. This is where I will briefly pause to climb onto a soapbox and announce to you, Legal Beagle, that it's my personal opinion that commercial sex is not consensual sex because of the extraordinary disparity in power. Further, there was no way for Halfacre to know whether or not the commercial sex he purchased, and in at least one case stole, was actually voluntary, that it was victimless and not sex trafficking. I don't have a lot of faith in his ability to classify anyone as a victim, in spite of his volunteering to support survivors of sexual assault at a previous command. Thai nationals engaging in commercial sex in Bahrain were already in a legally precarious position, a fact Halfacre had to know. Sex workers in Bahrain operate outside the bounds of the law, and it was objectively unlikely that a sex worker would report Halfacre's assault to Bahraini police. They would have opened themselves to arrest, investigation, and deportation. I wonder whether there are other victims out there. Victims that slipped through the cracks or never felt safe reporting their experience because they feared being treated as a perpetrator instead of as a victim. Halfacre assumed that fear would keep these women quiet, and upon discovering their reports, he tried to buy their silence. I suspect that Halfacre's downfall was that one of the women he attacked knew an NCIS informant, her mama-san. Mary's mama-san knew how to make a report count for something and exactly who to talk to, without having to go to the Bahraini police. In January 2019, after his preliminary hearing, Halfacre entered a pretrial agreement. He agreed that he would plead guilty to just 3 specifications of patronizing a prostitute. In exchange, the convening authority dropped the sexual assault charges, capped confinement at 30 months, and further agreed that if the judge sentenced Halfacre to a dishonorable discharge, the convening authority would disapprove that and drop him to a bad conduct discharge. After this guilty plea, the prosecutors and defense counsel made their sentencing arguments. Prosecutors argued that patronizing a prostitute was just how Halfacre committed other crimes, specifically repeated sexual assault. Defense counsel argued that a reduction in 1 grade and 89 days of confinement would be the appropriate outcome. It's apparent they hoped Halfacre could stay in the Navy. Halfacre made an unsworn statement and said that when he got to Bahrain, unburdened of his family, he struggled. He was, quote, able to drink more than he ever had. He had too much time to go out and do a lot of crazy stuff. Friends, this is not great mitigation. Halfacre essentially said he made bad decisions because he found himself with unchecked free time and only his own conscience to guide him. He said himself that most of the bars in Bahrain knew him, and that stood out to me. He squandered the opportunity to connect with his family in their afternoons so he could be a man about town at the bars. Only being a good partner or a good father when his family was looking means he wasn't really being good at either. One of the Thai women wrote in her victim impact statement that she thought daily about what Halfacre did to her and the other women. She asserted that he chose the three of them because he did not think they would report his violence, because they were not from Bahrain and had a lot to lose. Things get a little geographically fuzzy here. Halfacre paid Thai nationals for commercial sex in Bahrain. His court-martial was held in Naples, Italy, and it seems that after he signed his plea agreement, he spent time in Virginia before his sentencing. I put that together because it would appear that Halfacre had a little too much liberty before his sentencing, and a woman alleged that on February 3, 2019, Calvin Halfacre raped her in Virginia Beach. A month later, in March 2019, the military judge decided 3 months of confinement and a demotion of 1 grade was not, in fact, the appropriate conclusion to the case. The judge sentenced Calvin Halfacre to 30 months of confinement, reduction to E1, and a dishonorable discharge. The convening authority honored the terms of the plea agreement and reduced the dishonorable discharge to a bad conduct discharge. The Navy confined Halfacre at the Navy brig in Chesapeake, Virginia, to serve his time and participate in his second court-martial. Approximately 1 year later, in April 2020, while he was still incarcerated, Halfacre's wife filed for divorce. Ultimately, in April 2021, the second court-martial panel of enlisted members found Halfacre not guilty of rape, attempted rape, robbery, and assault with intent to commit rape for Halfacre's alleged actions in Virginia Beach. In spite of receiving the benefit of the bargain with his plea agreement, Calvin Halfacre appealed his sentence to the Navy and Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals, the NMCCA. He argued that his sentence was inappropriately severe, and that evidence of the sexual assaults should not have come in as aggravating evidence of patronizing a prostitute. The bulk of the appeal revolves around rules of evidence, but I don't want to move into that without very briefly touching on the argument that 30 months of confinement and getting kicked out of the Navy was inappropriately severe. It blows my mind when people have an opportunity to negotiate, come to an agreement, and are then upset about the outcome. Before the government agreed to drop the charges for sexual assault, Halfacre faced a maximum confinement period of 90 years. That's up to 30 years for each specification of sexual assault. When Halfacre faced sentencing for only 3 specifications of patronizing a prostitute, his maximum exposure dropped to just 36 months. He negotiated a cap of 30 months, then got salty about being maxed out at that cap and getting discharged. He had the opportunity to negotiate remaining in the Navy regardless of his sentence, if that was truly a sticking point for him. The NMCCA was not persuaded by his sob story. They disagreed that his sentence evoked, quote, immediate surprise and was excessive in nature. The NMCCA affirmed that Halfacre received the punishment he deserved. Circling back to the issue of the terrible, no good, very bad evidence that got Halfacre unceremoniously booted out of the Navy, the evidence of sexual assault. When the judge decided Halfacre's sentence, Halfacre only had to face the music for patronizing a prostitute. There were no charges for sexual assault. So why did the judge get to consider evidence of sexual assault? Halfacre's appellate counsel argued that it was inappropriate for the judge to consider evidence of an uncharged crime in determining Halfacre's sentence, and, further, that the evidence was unfairly prejudicial. So let's break that down. Evidence offered under Rule for Courts Martial 1001b4 is offered as evidence in aggravation. This rule permits the government to introduce evidence of any aggravating circumstances directly relating to or resulting from the offense of which the accused has been found guilty. Evidence in aggravation is offered to assist the sentencing authority to properly contextualize an offense. In order for evidence of uncharged misconduct to come in, the misconduct must be directly related to the crime, that is, closely related in time, type, and often outcome. Calvin Halfacre was found guilty of patronizing a prostitute, and how he patronized the prostitute was directly related to the offense he was being sentenced for. The sexual assaults were contemporaneous with patronizing a prostitute and directly related to the act of commercial sex. It was not a straightforward exchange of money for sex. Calvin Halfacre went beyond the terms of each agreement and assaulted 3 women. Halfacre used committing one crime as a vehicle for contemporaneously committing another. The NMCCA took all this into account and concluded that the sexual assaults were sufficiently close in time and type to the offenses Halfacre was convicted of. The second issue the court had to consider around this evidence in aggravation was whether unfair prejudice outweighed the probative value of the evidence, a balancing test laid out in Military Rule of Evidence 403. Unfair prejudice is often an issue of emotions, when the evidence might induce a decision on a purely emotional basis. The court-martial judge laid out that the statements from each woman would only be considered as they pertain to her, that the evidence would only be considered as evidence in aggravation, and that Halfacre would only be sentenced for patronizing a prostitute, not for sexual assault. It's not mentioned in the appellate opinion, but I think severing Halfacre the assailant from Halfacre the sex buyer would be an easier task for a trained judge than a panel of peers. I think the fact that it was a judge sitting alone made this analysis a little easier. I think it's also important to note that the judge was, at least on his face, not making emotionally charged decisions with respect to the sentence. Halfacre was eligible for a total of 36 months of confinement. I would assume that if the judge was unfairly prejudiced, he would have maxed Halfacre out at 36 months. Instead, he sentenced him to 30 months. The NMCCA found that the judge correctly applied the 403 balancing test and properly considered the evidence in aggravation in his sentencing decision. Halfacre appealed this decision to the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, where he was denied cert. It would seem that he is struggling to get his life back on track, and he was recently evicted from his apartment in March 2023. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to review Conduct Unbecoming. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com. Join me next time when we take a very timely peek at undue command influence. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, endorsed, or authorized by the Department of Defense.